So in the article, you also say that the yield that they buy these bonds at, they don't even pay the interest on the loan. They give it back to Treasury?
Right. So, this is when you first, this is something that I didn't even fully realize until recently. When you say something provocative like, oh, the Fed's a giant counterfeiter and that it's all just a big scheme, at first glance it seems like, well, no, that's a little bit of a simplification because the Treasury, it sells those bonds, and yes, the Fed ends up buying a bunch of them, and the bonds are sitting on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, but the Treasury still makes interest payments. Whether the bond is held by someone in the private sector or whether it's held by China or, Ben Bernanke, in effect, the Treasury still makes its contractual interest payments on all that debt, but the deal is that of all the interest payments that flow into the Federal Reserve's coffers, most of it goes right out the back door to the Treasury. And so the Fed, makes all this income because it doesn't really have many expenses. It just, has to pay some salaries and pay for the building and electricity and stuff like that. It creates money out of thin air. It buys a bunch of bonds, and then those bonds earn interest. But then the Fed, after it pays its employees' salaries and so forth, whatever's left over, it just gives it right back to the Treasury. And in the article, I give a link to the actual Treasury website showing how much the Fed gave to the Treasury in 2009, I think it was. So the idea is if you're borrowing money, so the Fed creates money that's in there, lends it to the Treasury, and then the interest that the Treasury pays on that debt, the Fed gives most of it right back to the Treasury. So it's an interest-free loan, effectively.
Mm-hmm. And they have to print up this money to give it back, don't they?
Well, technically, they're getting it through tax revenue. So it's the Treasury taxes money from taxpayers, hands some of it over to the Fed as an interest payment, and then the Fed just says, "Here you go, we'll give it right back to you."
Okay, so the shareholders of the Federal Reserve don't have a problem with that. So that kind of takes away from saying that the Fed is its own private corporation that we should be worried about because it's private.
Right. So I do think it's a very important point, and a lot of people who are very conspiratorial, and I'm not using that term pejoratively, I'm just saying, that they really do think there's sinister people lurking behind the scenes running these things. One of their major points, they don't like it when a free market economist sort of lumps the Fed in with the government and just talks as if the Fed is just some arm of the government the way the CIA or the Pentagon is. They don't like that because they say, no, the Fed is not a government entity. It's a private entity that's owned by shareholders, and that's a true statement. It is. But the reason private bankers benefit from the Fed isn't because of getting interest payments from the U.S. Treasury on government debt. That's not the way it benefits. Mm-hmm. Because as you noted, most of that money they just hand right back to the government. So that's not the reason for having a central bank, and the reason that benefits bankers and big Wall Street guys. It's not for that reason. It's because of what we talked about in the beginning of the show, that having the Fed there sort of enforces the cartel, and it allows the banks to have fractional reserve banking. So the way the banks make their money is through making loans and giving them to their own customers, granting mortgages and loans to business people that aren't backed up by cash in the vault. So that's the way the private banking system benefits from this whole arrangement, is because they're basically doing the same thing at a smaller level as what Bernanke is doing. When a private commercial bank gives somebody a mortgage, effectively they're creating money out of thin air too. When they just say, okay, you have now $200,000 in your checking account and you can go buy a house with it, a lot of that money just they created it through a bookkeeping entry. It's not that there was $200,000 in cash in the vault. And so it's sort of like what the Fed does, but on a much smaller scale.
I see. So you also tell us that when a Treasury bond comes due, the Federal Reserve just rolls over the debt. Can you explain what that actually means?
Yeah, sure. So that's the last piece of the puzzle. So again, you start with this provocative claim that, hey, the Federal Reserve is basically this giant counterfeiting scheme that helps the government. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's crazy because, the government, they borrow money from the Fed, but they have to make interest payments, and we've already seen, but the Fed gives most of that interest payment right back. So then the last leg you could say is, well, wait a minute, but there's still the principal. So sure, the Fed might give the interest payments back to the Treasury, but if the Fed, lent $1 million to the Treasury by buying bonds, of a face value of $1 million, well, the Treasury still has to, when that bond comes due, come up with $1 million and give it to the Fed, right? But, that's technically true, but historically, the Feds, if you look at a graph of the total amount of Treasury securities held by the Fed, their overall market value, that always rises, or, at least over a decent time period, the average value is always going up over time. So the idea is the Fed is always, so whenever a bond comes due, and technically the Treasury, owes $1 million to the Fed just is willing to roll that over. They're just willing to lend it right back to them. And so the outstanding balance of what the Treasury is on the hook for to the Fed grows over time. So not only does the Treasury get interest-free loans effectively, but they also know deep down they're never going to have to pay off the principal. And so those loans truly are painless. And since that money was just created out of thin air, that's the sense in which I'm claiming this is basically a counterfeit operation. It's effectively as if the government covers its deficits by running the printing press. It's just they have to go through this real convoluted scheme with the Fed because it would be too naked. If the government literally just created $100 bills to cover their deficit, most people would say, you can't do that. That's inflationary. But when it's going through all this complicated thing like you and I have been talking about, it's really hard to see exactly what's going on.
Right. So those people that say, well, we need to just have the Fed be part of the government, and then we could trust it. Those people are obviously mistaken as well, because the whole point is the power over the printing press.
Right. The one, again, I wouldn't even advocate that because I think it would be inflationary and it wouldn't work. And what, if we can get the public ginned up to see what's going on with the current system, I think it would just, why would you want to replace it with something that's flawed as well? But the one thing I would say in defense of the people who are saying, why don't we just have the government directly take over and issue the currency directly and not have this convoluted scheme of loans and so forth, the one good thing about that is the public would more clearly see the connection between rising prices and the government printing more money. Mm-hmm. Whereas right now, this whole scheme, it's taken you and me this long just to even explain what's going on. That's just very complicated. So again, the one virtue of getting rid of the Fed and just having the Treasury literally run a printing press to cover the deficit is that, when prices went up 5% in a given year, most people would understand, oh, that's because the Treasury was spending more than it had, and it just printed up those dollar bills for the difference, and that's why prices are rising. It would be a lot easier to pin the blame on who was causing this price inflation, whereas now it's just so complicated, people have no idea what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So you say at the end of it all, the only thing really holding back the Fed from running the printing press are steep price increases or inflation, economy-wide inflation?
Yeah, that's the ultimate check. So and then it goes back to what Rothbard was saying, that under a private banking system, there were much stronger checks that if any individual bank inflated too much by, creating new loans and basically creating money out of thin air on its books, that would quickly come back to bite it because of, the reserve withdrawals. But when the whole system is, the whole financial system is just under the umbrella of the Fed and its fiat currency, the only thing really stopping it is if they printed up too much money, prices would rise and the public would get angry. And the other thing too, of course, is if you're the world's reserve currency, you want to keep everybody happy, just like we've been talking about Russia and China and other places and oil-producing countries are getting a little unsettled by all the things that Bernanke has been doing, and they're starting making waves about maybe we shouldn't use the dollar. If you're running the Fed, you don't like that kind of talk because you benefit from having people use the dollar. So they do have to be cautious. They can't just print up a ton of money. But right now in this crisis, Bernanke's created over $1 trillion, just bought assets like crazy, writing checks on thin air, and we haven't seen massive price inflation. And so for the last 18 months or so, he's basically been able to hand out a bunch of money to these rich investment bankers who made bad loans and so on, and there hasn't apparently been devastating consequences. So that's a very dangerous situation because people are calling for him to create even more money, and I think it's just there's a delayed effect here.
Well, let me stop you there, and we'll come back with our short segment after this quick break.